tossed on a deserted island with nothing but your own thoughts does not sound like an ideal vacation. However, to many pirates, this was just one of the many terrible punishments they had to endure. First up, we have keel hauling. This is sort of like a terrible version of water skiing. There are many ways a pirate could land themselves in trouble with their peers. There was all sorts of ways they could be punished. One of the worst of the bunch was a method known as keel hauling. This resulted in the troubled pirate being tied to the back of the ship and tossed overboard. They would be dragged through the water on the end of the rope as the pirates on board would attempt to drag them to the other side of the ship. It was not the most common form of punishment, but it was definitely one of the worst of the bunch. It was a terrible experience to be tied to the back of the ship, but it could also result in irreversible consequences for the pirate who was tossed overboard. Many of them would often drown as they would be left underwater for long periods of time, so it's easy to see why this punishment was reserved for the very worst of the bunch. Next on our list is marooning. Welcome to Castaway in real life. Lots of people like to kick back on sunny beaches these days, but for many pirates, these quiet islands had a whole different meaning. Anyone who committed a serious crime that went against the pirate code could end up receiving this terrible fate. A person who was sentenced to marooning would be transported to a deserted island in the middle of nowhere and left to fend for themselves. The only things they would be left with were a firearm and a bottle of their favorite beverage. There would be no food left behind for them, and the ship would eventually head back into the waters and leave the disgraced pirate alone with their own thoughts. It was a long and agonizing way for anyone to go, so marooning was widely regarded as one of the worst punishments the pirates had come up with. This brutal desertion was also a stern way of making sure that everyone on board a ship kept themselves in line and stuck to the pirate code. Up next is walking the plank. This is the diving board that you couldn't climb back up. Out of all the punishments that existed in the peak era of piracy, this one is probably the most famous of the bunch. Everything from Pirates of the Caribbean to SpongeBob SquarePants has referenced this punishment in some capacity, but it was definitely one of the worst ways to go. This form of punishment was handed out to some of the worst pirates of them all who had committed some inexcusable crimes. While it was often used on rival pirates who had attempted to invade another clan's ship, it would also sometimes be used to banish any members who broke their own code. A long wooden plank would hang off the edge of a ship, and commanding officers would force their enemy towards the end of it. Of course, they really had no choice at this point but to dive into the water below. They could do their best to swim back to safety, but they would usually be so far from land that they stood absolutely no chance. Next up, we have clapped in irons. This was more of a humiliation than anything else. It was definitely far from the worst punishment a pirate could face, but it was something that everyone wanted to avoid. If a person was sentenced to be clapped in irons, they would usually be tossed into a dark corner of the ship for extended periods of time with very little food or water. If they did receive any nutrients, it would usually just be leftovers that other pirates did not want to eat. Sometimes this punishment would only last for a couple of hours, but repeat offenders might have to spend an entire day in this unfortunate predicament. While the dark corner was the usual place for the iron clapping, some pirates would actually be tied to the boom that hung off the front of the ship or left on the deck during a rainstorm. No matter where the commanders decided to place the disgraced pirate, they were guaranteed to be in for a very rough ride. After that, we have branding. Most people will associate this with cattle, but branding had a much different purpose for sailors on the high seas. This was actually a common method the authorities would use when they captured a pirate. This is pretty much exactly what you would picture, and it's something that every pirate on the high seas would want to avoid. Authorities would heat the branding stick to extremely hot temperatures and would place a very painful imprint on the criminal's body. This would usually be on a very visible body part such as the neck and the forehead to ensure the pirate would have to endure public humiliation for his antics. The branding image would often be the letter P to warn everyone that they encountered that a pirate was in their presence. Many shops and bars were either too scared of pirates or would simply refuse service to them, so having a giant P on your face would not help anyone's chances in town. Next on our list is the sun cage. A trip to a sunny island really wasn't a good thing for many pirates. Seems like largely deserted islands were incredibly popular with pirates for very dark reasons. While they would use the island to dispose of any unwanted members, the authorities also decided that this was an effective way to deal with the bad seeds in the world. British authorities who managed to catch any of the most wanted pirates in the Caribbean had one particular spot that they preferred to use for punishments. Dead Man's Key is a very small Caribbean island you can still visit today, but it has a very grisly past. British authorities would transport their captive pirates to the island and stuff them in large metal cages. The cages would then be hung from trees, and the convicted criminals would be left out in the sun for the rest of their time on Earth. This was a brutal way for anyone to go, and it must have been absolutely terrifying for any unsuspecting visitors to discover these cages. This was a clear message from the authorities, however, that they meant business. Up next is the Cat of Nine Tails. This simple looking object was one of the worst sights for any pirate. We can assure you that the Cat of Nine Tails is not a majestic creature, and it is definitely not friendly. This was the name that was given to a whip that featured on pretty much every single pirate ship. It had 9 strands knotted at the ends, and the only purpose it served was to deliver crushing blows to anyone who misbehaved. The ideal number of lashings according to pirate code was 39, because apparently that was the maximum number a person could survive. The whip was kept in a particular bag and would only be taken out when they had to deal with serious prisoners, hence the expression "let the cat out of the bag." The nastiest part about the whole ordeal though was that it was rarely ever cleaned. This meant that it would usually still have remnants from the last prisoner that would lead to infections in whoever was next to face the cat. So even though a person might survive the 39 lashings, there's a strong chance they wouldn't be able to handle the ensuing infections. After that we have sweating. Dancing while being poked by large sticks sounds like a really bad party game. This one might not be as gruesome as other pirate punishments, but it is certainly one of the most humiliating. You might think that sweating would involve being locked in a very hot room, but it actually involves a ton of dancing in front of the crew. The only problem is that the dancing is forced and the rest of the crew is making it incredibly painful. In this form of punishment, a pirate who was caught committing some minor infractions would be tied to a central mast and would be forced to dance for the rest of their crew. The rest of the pirates would gather around the mast and prod the dancer with large sticks and spears to make sure the dancing wouldn't stop until they were satisfied. It was nicknamed sweating because the pirate who was forced to dance would usually be pretty nervous with a gang of angry pirates standing around them with large sharp objects. The idea was to make sure that someone would think twice about breaking the code unless they want to relive the embarrassing punishment. Next up is Mast Heading. This might have been the origin for some future high school pranks. This is another pirate punishment that was used for minor infractions, but was still incredibly uncomfortable and humiliating. There was no poking with large sticks or dancing in front of angry pirates, but this one aimed to isolate anyone who violated the pirate code. The pirate who had committed the petty infraction would have to climb the masthead and stay up there by themselves for an extended period of time. There would be no food or water, and no one would pay any attention to them while they stayed in their elevated prison. This also meant that they would be subjected to the elements, which could get very troublesome. Heavy winds and rain would make this punishment seriously uncomfortable, and the feeling of isolation was very real. Repeat offenders would sometimes be left in the masthead overnight to make things even more lonely. The only way to get through it was to tough it out until the full penalty had been served. And finally we have slavery. This one had a couple different methods, but each one was just as bad as the other. For a pirate who was caught trying to steal from a rival clan, the captors would sometimes use their prisoner as a slave to handle all the dirty work on their ship. Sometimes it was just petty chores, but other times it would be dangerous tasks that could be life-threatening. The other form of slavery that was used as punishment was if a clan caught one of their own members committing a very serious crime. If there was a serious violation of the pirate code, and the rest of the crew didn't think it was worth keeping them around anymore, they would sometimes sell their disgraced matey into slavery. This obviously meant that your crew didn't care about you anymore and valued money over your life. There were all sorts of terrible people who might buy the pirates used as their slave, and many viewed this as a terrible life sentence. It might not have been the most gruesome punishment in the world, but it was certainly one of the worst. And that covers our look at the 10 brutal ways pirates were punished on the high seas. Seems like these strict codes had some even stricter punishments for anyone who was foolish enough to break them. Thanks as always for tuning in everyone, and we'll see you all next time.